James Nolan's a widely published fiction writer, poet, essayist, and translator. His 11 books include the recent You Don't Know Me, New and Selected Stories, which was the winner of the 2015 Independent Publishers Gold Medal in Southern Fiction, and the novel Higher Ground, which was awarded the William Faulkner Wisdom Gold Medal in the novel. He has taught at universities in San Francisco, Florida, Barcelona, Madrid, and Beijing, as well as in his native New Orleans. Please welcome James Nolan.
Thank you all for coming out. I'm not going to use the mic. I think everyone can hear me, can you? I should also mention that I'm a fifth generation New Orleanian. And as a inbred Southerner, I have to say that we Southerners relate to each other by telling stories. We're storytellers. You know, they usually say if you ask a Yankee something, they'll give you an opinion. If you ask a Southerner something, they'll tell you a story. And so basically what a memoir is a series of stories. It's the story kind of my life. And I have just a brief paragraph I'll read you about why I wrote this. Like many Southerners, I relate to people by telling them stories. The ones I come back to are often my own. We are the stories of our lives. And storytelling is how we integrate our personalities into an autonomous I, the past into present. Our selective memories edit us into being with the blue pencil of passing time. And I emphasize selective memories. What you include and what you don't include is always very important in creating what I would call the memoir persona, because the persona you're creating in your memoir is not quite exactly who you are. I mean, you don't have to talk about your allergies or your bank accounts if it's not relevant to the story you're telling. The storytelling instinct is more than entertainment or self-aggrandizement. It wells up from an atavistic place connected to self-preservation and tribal identity. So the storyteller is really kind of a griot or a shaman, and in telling his story, it becomes the story of the tribe. And so it really kind of is like the bard sitting around the fire. And so this after-dinner anecdote that you might think we all tell each other is really a distant echo of this very tribal storytelling instinct that unifies us. The memoir persona, at least mine, are what I call wince moments. When you go back to a part of your life that makes you wince. I think F. Scott Fitzgerald said, if you've had a really, Anita, hey, if you've really had an embarrassing moment in your life that you would hesitate to really think about or even tell anyone, that's what goes in your memoir. So it's certainly not a place to sing your own praises. And it takes a perspective of time. It's very hard to write memoirs while you're living an experience. And I once tried to teach memoir writing at Tulane to undergraduates, and they wrote me these memoirs about getting drunk and getting late, hooking up last Saturday night. And it takes a lot of time and perspective to kind of hone a memory into a good story. And I think the best subject of the memoir are the delusions of youth from another perspective in time. And one of the titles I had thought of for the memoir was "It Seemed Like a Good Idea at the Time." Another I had thought of was "Inappropriate: A Life." And the reason this is called Flight Risk is that I left New Orleans when I was 19 years old and was away for about 35 years. And I've been in some pretty sticky situations in life, most of which I escaped from. So this book it begins with a chapter in which my parents committed me in 1968 to St. Vincent de Paul Mental Hospital because I was in the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement. And then I was in jail in Guatemala for being a sort of insurgent in the 70s, and I escaped from that. And then I lived in China for a year right after the Cultural Revolution, and I escaped from that. And then, lo and behold, I was living here during Katrina and didn't evacuate, and I had to escape from that in a stolen school bus, by the way. And so my life has been a series of escapes, in a way. And it's interesting that my great-great-grandparents escaped from France in the 1850s and came to New Orleans and set up a tobacco business in the French Quarter, right at Chartres and St. Philip, actually, right across from the Hogan House. That's Toulouse. And there's something about the American spirit that we all come from hard-scrabble beginnings of immigrants or people forced to leave their countries for reasons that they didn't choose to. And so we're very good at what I call the fight or flee instinct of getting out of situations. So I'm going to read a couple of sections from this. And it begins with, it doesn't begin when I'm born. Actually, I'm not born until chapter 3. I was born during a hurricane, actually. I was born during the hurricane that destroyed New Orleans in 1947. That's how old I am. And it was, my mother called it Hurricane James, because in those days, hurricanes weren't named. And I begin with a chapter called 68, about 1968 when I was 19, and my parents committed me. And I have to say that I'm glad that I began the book with this chapter, because I've never felt, since this year in the United States feels just like 1968 to me, with all the divisiveness, polarization, social upheaval. It really, I feel exactly like it felt in 1968, when I think Johnson was president. But we were in the middle of the Vietnam War. We were at the culminating moment of the civil rights movement, which of course meant that I was crazy, right? I was involved with this. And so I just began, I'm just going to read little snippets from the book. 68. My big sin at the moment, the reason they committed me, is I was running away from home to live in New York City, to become a postmodernist. And it didn't look like I would be going to New York City that winter after all. Neither would I be heading back to college in St. Petersburg, Florida. The Greyhound bus fare that my girlfriend Joy Lynn had wired me to escape over the Louisiana state line was waiting at American Express, but I wouldn't be claiming it anytime soon. As I lay on the bed in the darkened ward, on the other side of barred windows, the night sky over uptown New Orleans crackled with fireworks. It was New Year's Eve, 1967, and bombs were exploding in Vietnam. Both in Southeast Asia and within my own family, we were at war. The world was on fire. On the eve of the revolution, I was on Rosary 3, the acutely disturbed ward of St. Vincent de Paul, a mental hospital run by the Daughters of Charity. How could my parents do this to me? And I tell the story of how I eventually did get out, and it was through the American Civil Liberties Union. And I was going to be the test case for involuntary coroner commitments in the state of Louisiana. And this case was won in 1976. So I'm glad I got out on the writ of habeas corpus. It was quite an interesting experience, and it explained why I wanted to get out of New Orleans, which I felt was a very dark and backward place, quite frankly. I have another little section here that's a little more lighthearted, and it's about how I became an artist. And we were living, I think, in Gentilly at that point on Fye Street. This is from a chapter called Paper Sparrows and the Black Sexton. The moment I became an artist was inspired by the chirping sparrows that built a nest in the crepe myrtle outside of our kitchen window. I was 4, and we were living temporarily at 6228 LaFaye Street in a termite-ridden house on which my grandfather had just blown the last of his Memphis inheritance. My grandparents lived on the other side of the double, along with their daughter, Doris, the first love of my life. And of course, growing up, we always lived next to my grandparents. At one point, we lived in 4 generations, great-grandparents, grandparents, my parents, and us, because that's the way Creoles lived at that time. There was no such thing as daycare or nursing homes. One day, my mother pointed out that the mama sparrow in the crepe myrtle was sitting on a handful of tiny eggs in her nest. And every day, we peeked out of the window until the eggs hatched and turned into peeping fledglings. Christine, hey. I was enraptured and wondered how I could be a bird too. I came up with a plan and set to work coloring eggs on construction paper. Doris helped me cut out the eggs and then fill a shoebox with dried grass in which to nestle. For several days, I sat on my straw nest of eggs waiting for them to hatch. As anyone could see, I was a sparrow. Although this avant-garde installation exhausted any parental instincts I might harbor for the rest of my life, I was forever hooked on the miraculous act of representation. By drawing eggs on construction paper, I could give birth to a nest of paper sparrows which would fly fully hatched from my mind until they filled the sky over Gentilly. I also took flight, and leaving behind the old world bequeathed to me by generations of insular Creoles, I discovered a new one, the borderless country of the imagination, the only one in which I've ever claimed full citizenship. Its gates swung open, and I stepped in, bringing only my wildest dreams and a box of waxy Crayolas that smelled better than fudge ripple ice cream. So that was my first act as an artist, was to do this little installation, sitting on paper eggs so that they would hatch just like the mother sparrow. Oh, I have another section from this chapter I'd like to read. I'm trying to budget my time here. And this was about growing up in New Orleans in the 50s, when it was quite a different place. Is anyone here from New Orleans? People become confused when I speak of my socialist youth. So let me clarify. No, I wasn't raised in a Soviet village or a Havana tenement, but in New Orleans, a hotbed of right-wing politics. But during the 50s and early 60s, when I was growing up, everything was public, a word that now carries sinister connotations of radical socialism. I'm reading this on a review Long built this building. In those days, I rode the public bus to a public school, then stopped by the public library before we played ball in the public street. In the summers, I went to a public day camp at the YMCA at Lee Circle, and any illness or accident brought us to public charity hospital. And many weekends were spent at the public pool in City Park, where we picnicked, rode the flying horses, and my father played golf. During the Depression, the WPA constructed both the hospital and park facilities as part of Roosevelt's socialist public works program that rebuilt the infrastructure of the country. To us, the Column Main branch of the public library at Lee Circle, the Delgado Art Museum in City Park, as it was then called, and the imposing municipal auditorium where operas, concerts, and carnival balls were staged, appeared as majestic temples of culture. My deeply conservative family took these public facilities for granted and indeed expected them to be there, paid for by their taxes. Private schools, pools, concert venues, recreation, and transportation were in some other country, not the one where I grew up. From age 10, I took buses and streetcars throughout the city by myself, often carrying little more than my 14 cents round-trip fare. My mother told my sister and me that if we were ever lost or had a problem, just to ask a policeman. That meant the cops were highly visible, stationed on street corners or walking beats, maintaining the public order. The police weren't speeding past in squad cars, staring at computer screens as they are today, but were operating on 2 flat feet, controlling the pedestrian streets. Despite the family's precarious finances, my childhood world seemed civilized, a word rooted in the Greek civitas, which means public or collective. My insomniac grandfather, when he couldn't sleep, would often stroll at 3 a.m. through the 7th Ward in his pajamas, bathrobe and slippers toward Esplanade Avenue to get some air, the same air now whizzing with drug dealers' bullets. Late on Saturday nights, drunken knife fights sometimes broke out on raucous corner bar rooms in the neighborhood, but I never saw a gun, windows weren't barred, and it never occurred to me to be afraid. The public facilities that were part of my daily life cut across all class and ethnic lines, except of course for one. This was before racial integration. After integration, which didn't begin in full legal rigor until I was in high school, everything began to privatize, and the city turned over the ruins of the underfunded public sphere, the schools, parks, buses, hospitals, pools, and libraries we had always depended on, to what some white folks referred to as you-know-who. Blacks were finally invited to be part of the general public, but only after everyone else had left for private schools, carpools, clinics, country clubs, and the suburbs, taking their tax base with them. And white people cut off their noses to spite their faces, radically reordering their lives, first and foremost, to avoid any contact with blacks. By the late 60s, the bustling collective sphere I grew up in had crumbled, and the once lofty word public had become indistinguishable from the N-word. As far as I can tell, today, the unwritten foundation of the Republican Party platform is quite obvious. Public was fine when it was for us, but don't give any of our money to you-know-who. I'm sure that's, some of you might find that fairly radical, but that's the way I grew up. What I like to do in these various chapters is provide what I call hooks, meaning it's a kind of way to get you into a chapter. I really want to write a first sentence that will keep you reading, which I recommend to my writing students always. And so here are a few hooks that I've used in various chapters. This is about my life in San Francisco in the 70s, called Stairway to Paradise. The night Mick Jagger picked me up in San Francisco. Did anyone stop reading this? I was spending my last $2 on a Heineken at a terrace table of the Savoy Tivoli in North Beach. Another hook. What was behind the green door, which is about San Francisco in the 80s. When I saw my first porn movie, I wasn't carried away by waves of lust. After the opening sequence, I was more in a state of shock. My Argentine friend Raul told me that he once entered a porn theater on Times Square only to find his sister, an aspiring actress, writhing on the screen. So imagine my surprise when Marilyn Chambers, star of the feature I was watching, was pulled from a car and thrown through my front door. I rubbed my eyes. It couldn't be true. I dare you to stop reading. Okay, here's another hook from Our Hell in High Water, which is a piece I actually did for the Washington Post. Wrote it here in Baton Rouge after I was forced out of New Orleans. The real nightmare began last Wednesday when the city cut off the water supply, 2 days after Katrina slammed into New Orleans and the levees breached. Another hook on another Katrina chapter, which I'm very fond of. Today I'm flying on a bankrupt airline into a bankrupt city powered by a bankrupt energy company. That was a month later when I returned to the building. So I think the idea is that you want to get your reader into it, create some tension in the very first sentence that'll keep them from putting it down. I'll read part of a section on one of my Katrina chapters. The first thing I noticed climbing the stairs to the party is the sea of unstrung violins gleaming in the moonlight on the rooftop. We were driving through Lakeview and saw mounting violins on the curb, explains Andy Young, who was talking here today, the poet hosting this party of returning quarter denizens. There must have been at least 500, all bent and soggy. So we loaded some of the least damaged ones into the car, and now they're drying on the roof. A sepulchral silence reigns in a city where all of the violins are warped, and only an eighth of the residents are back testing the waters, perhaps just for a few days. Through the window opened over the moonlit pool of warped violins, I spot flames on the horizon. They are licking up into a pitch-black sky from a part of the city where streetlights are still out. Rumors fly. Is it close to the quarter? Are firemen back on the job? Everywhere there are fires or reports of fires. We listen for sirens and hear none. What we hear is Herbie Kearney, an Irish painter with a long braided beard who looks like a Blakean angel. He is standing in the middle of the room, knees doubled in a half squat, howling from the center of his being like a dog. He howls like the wolves who prowl forests after a fire searching for their mates, like the skeletal mutts in forsaken Mexican plazas after the harvest has failed, like the strays who keep watch under the windows of the sick, foretelling death. Care for another glass of wine, Herbie? Someone asks when he's finished. Exhausted by the tension, we crack up and gulp wine with him, glass after glass, while a sleeky black cat twines between our feet. On the way home, carrying my foil-wrapped plate of leftover lamb, I encounter soldiers in battle fatigue standing guard next to their Humvees on all corners at Royal and Dumaine, where I live. Thank you. I mumble a civil good evening, and their eyes drop unsmiling to meet mine, heads held erect. The night air smells caustic as tar paper, sweet as decay, and tastes like the figs of Fallujah. For blocks around, not one sound. Not a soul is walking on Royal or Dumaine. Nothing is moving far into the darkened, refrigerator-lined ruins of Lake Vista and Lakeview, Mid-City and the Lower Ninth Ward. Inside the musty contagion of a tomb in St. Louis Cemetery No. 3, my mother is sinking down into the bony arms of my grandmother, who is resting on the shoulder of her father, who has collapsed into the chalky remains of his own mother. In flaking gold lettering above their names, a silent prayer floats across the flooded, feverish centuries we have survived. Parce que le temps passe, je prie pour vous. Because time passes, I pray for you. Mère, prepare, who is left to speak for you? Upstairs, Mercury, in winged helmet, is still at his post on the mantel, in the mantel clock, ticking. I push my speakers onto the balcony and put a prized piece of vinyl onto the turntable, blasting Bob Dylan's raspy, lonesome moan into the ghost town streets. And the only sound that's left after the ambulances go is Cinderella sweeping up on Desolation Road. I'm not sure if the soldiers below understand his words. I'd like to imagine they do, but no boots stomp up the stairs, nobody pounds at the door. Perhaps their war games are over for the evening, or they're needed in another forlorn corner of the empire. Before the song has ended, they're gone. Any questions? There's a lot more I could read, but
I just was wondering, how did you escape Vietnam?
How did I escape what?
Vietnam.
Oh, because I was committed. And the first thing I did was write a letter to my draft board, and I said, please change my address from 421 South Clark Street, New Orleans, Louisiana, to St. Vincent de Paul Insane Asylum, such as such Henry Clay Avenue, New Orleans, Louisiana. Thank you for your attention to this matter. And within a month, I got a 4F card back in the mail. So I was very proudly incapable of slaughter or invasion.
That's probably why they did it.
No, it wasn't. It was.
What are you doing now?
I live in New Orleans still. I just moved from the French Quarter, where I lived since I returned home in '96. I lived in the French Quarter for 20 years. I can't live in the French Quarter anymore. It's become a Disneyland or theme park. So I moved to the neighborhood I grew up in around Bayou St. John, near City Park. And it's called the Lully Mansion. It's an old decaying mansion from 1865. And I teach advanced writing workshops. I work with writers who are working on concrete writing projects. Before I had run this institute out of Loyola University for 12 years, and then from the Arts Council for 5 years, and now up to here with institutions. I'm just doing it on my own. So that's pretty much what I'm doing now. Still living in New Orleans.
Did you find it changed? It was, you said that it was radically conservative when you were there before. If you lived here in Baton Rouge, well, we think New Orleans is just as liberal as you can get.
It was radically conservative when I was growing up. And then when I started visiting home again in the 80s, I guess this was around the World's Fair, I suddenly realized, oh, New Orleans is fun. I didn't remember New Orleans as being fun. And now I feel like I'm not comfortable in the new New Orleans of mass tourism. I find it extremely oppressive and a completely unsustainable economy to have, which is mass tourism. So I think New Orleans is and then all the construction. I think our current mayor is trying to make New Orleans over into Atlanta. We don't want to be Atlanta. We want to be New Orleans. Yeah.
I'm from Sydney, Australia, and we still have the public that you described.
In most places in Europe also.
Although it is starting to change. I've been there almost 30 years.
Yeah, I was a resident of Europe for about 10 years. I lived and taught in Barcelona and Madrid. And yeah, so everything was public. Everyone went to public school. I taught at public universities that were free, practically. I took the public metro to work. I went to a public hospital. And so, because this is what they called Obama's European socialism. If you remember, it was public. The word, just simply the word public. And now that's now a curse word in the United States, anything public. So yes, no, Europe is still public, and I miss that aspect of it very, very much.
Well, public schools in England mean privileged schools.
No, that's a difference in terms.
Exactly, but back when you were growing up, public school was the best school, unless you were of a certain denomination.
Well, I was always threatened with being sent to
Religiously.
Catholic school. If you don't shape up, we're sending you to Catholic school. I'm not going to wear those khaki pants. I hated the uniforms. So I pretty much shaped up and did continue in public school. And then finally got into the best public school in New Orleans, which is Ben Franklin. That's why I graduated from Memoirs. So there's the schools that are getting better in New Orleans. The public transportation is certainly nothing like Europe. Things are in some ways getting better, but there's a new New Orleans of outside investment money in mass tourism that I don't know.
How did your relationship with your parents end up?
When I moved home, I moved back. I was living in Madrid, and I moved home because my mother had congestive heart failure, and she was taken to the hospital 3 times in 1 month. So I moved home, and we became very, very good friends. We never, ever discussed me being committed, because Southern families are steeped in denial, as those of you who are Southerners know. And we simply don't discuss unpleasant topics.
You think they would have regretted it had you?
But she continued seeing that psychiatrist for probably 25 years until he died.
Okay,
Yeah.
are we talking about, what's the name, do you say the name of the psychiatrist?
Do I want to tell you the name of the psychiatrist? It's in the book.
Okay, no, because
You want to spend
really, really
$25?
late.
What?
I had to work all morning. And she brought me in here, and so I don't have a background yet.
His name was Dr. Kyle Ham. He was a.
My mother's.
He was your mother's psychiatrist?
That was about 40 years ago.
Dr. Kyle Ham?
Yes, I know him.
He taught experimental psychology at Tulane.
Yes.
Specialist in adolescent schizophrenia.
With the crutches.
Yes! That's him.
Yeah.
I haven't.
Right by Audubon Park.
Yeah.
Had to pull. Okay.
Yeah, no,
Oh my
that's,
God.
I have a whole, that's my
He was
whole first
clinical.
chapter describing him and what I later found out about him. He had some
Oh,
deep,
yeah.
dark secrets of his own. I can't believe that was our mother's psychiatrist.
You're my best friend. She brought me in here. I didn't have a background yet.
Okay, yeah.
I misread the time and missed it all.
Yeah.
She had me in the true crime.
Well, same thing.
Okay.
I urge you to buy the book and read the first chapter, 68, because it's a.
I've read this already, I think. I think I have this story somewhere else.
Okay.
Has part of it been in print before?
It's been in magazines, yes, and
Okay.
and part of it is online. So.
Dr. Daddy or something like that?
Dr. who?
Dr. Dad. Or,
I called him Dr. Renadad.
yes.
Good.
Okay. This is awesome.
Yes. Okay, time's up.
Thank you.
I'll be serving flight risk in the book tent in about 15 minutes.